On this week's episode of Caribbean Diaries.
You need to be inclusive, include everyone in society, and I think you always have to think of the people who are most vulnerable. Many of us can work from home, but it's very often people who are, for example, cleaning staff and things like that. They are the ones we should really be prioritizing and not sort of forcing them onto public transport in a rush hour. Everything should be staggered so that they can be as safe as possible. It was very obvious that women have been disproportionately affected because very often they might be in single-parent households and they might face the ultimate impossible choice of, do I break sort of curfew to go and do some work, to put food on the table, or do I stay at home, look after my children and maybe help them school? I mean, this vaccine has been highly effective in preventing people developing severe disease and hospital. In a study of 35,000 people conducted in Brazil, South Africa and the UK, which is funnily enough where all the variants are, there wasn't a single case of severe disease in a vaccinated person.
Welcome to Caribbean Diaries. Joining me now to talk about the UWI's response to COVID-19 in the Caribbean is Professor Clive Landis. He's chairman of the UWI's COVID-19 Task Force. Hi, Professor Landis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasant good morning from Barbados. It's nice to be on Caribbean Diaries.
So first, let's start with the establishing of the task force. What are the main objectives?
Well, there were two main objectives. One was to prepare the university internally for the pandemic, and the second was to assist the Caribbean in helping to cope with it.
And what is the composition of the task force? I realized that as time progressed, you added members as it became more relevant. So how do you decide who makes up the task force?
Well, the university has a very large wingspan. We have everything from medicine and agriculture and zoology and psychology and social science. We've got everything available. And for this particular task force, as opposed to the Zika task force, we knew that this one had to be very large because of the societal effects. Mm-hmm. So we have experts spanning virology, epidemiology, laboratory diagnostics, critical care, pulmonology, so lung science, veterinary medicine, tourism, trade, psychology, psychiatry, ethics, gender expertise, developmental expertise, international relations, youth advocacy and communication. It's 20 members.
At the core of it, you say the main function and the emphasis is to provide accurate and reliable information through UWI and other channels of communication throughout the region. How do you collate or curate the information that you provide?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I always remember on January the 29th, in 2020, so over a year ago, we had our first session, which was called Demystifying the Coronavirus. And honestly, we could have that session all over again, because it was very clear at that point already that really what you were facing here was two epidemics. One was a viral epidemic, which is bad enough in itself, but the other one was just a misinformation epidemic. Yeah. And so we wanted to position ourselves as being, a very reliable source, an arbiter of good science, and the go-to place for our region's policymakers. And we were invited by the Caricom heads of government, by the Caribbean Public Health Agency, to provide that information source. And I think it has been a success.
Yeah. One of the things I think you've also done is you provided balance in the region because, arguably there are some countries that will have access to certain types of information and others may not. And I believe that the COVID-19 task force has been able to bring all of that together in one place to balance it for all nations.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And again, it was a deliberate undertaking. So, in February and March, the real emphasis was in trying to predict how our healthcare systems might cope with a full-blown, a full first wave.
Yeah.
And so we conducted these computer modeling exercises, which were using the same techniques as were done by Imperial College to kind of map what the impact of a pandemic would be under three scenarios. The scenarios where do nothing, act early, or act late. And when we actually carried out, and we did that every single Caricom country and the UK overseas territories, we mapped what the scenario would look like if you didn't do anything, or if you had certain measures or more stringent measures. And it showed the policymakers that, if we didn't act, this epidemic could just overwhelm us, a bit like how it did to New York and northern Italy. Mm-hmm. And I think to the region's credit, we actually suppressed the first wave completely.
How have you been pivoting? As I said earlier, I know that as the task force progressed, you've invited other members to join. As we've seen the way the pandemic has progressed, what are some of the things that you've done to ensure that this response team is dynamic and flexible enough to bend and move with COVID-19?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, we added economists, tourism experts. We added a gender expert. It was very obvious that women have been disproportionately affected, because very often they might be in single-parent households and they might face the ultimate impossible choice of, do I break sort of curfew to go and do some work to put food on the table, or do I stay at home, look after my children, and maybe help them school? It's just put women in an impossible position. So we also have a psychosocial care unit, which is looking at the psychological impact, and also an ethics unit. As you may be aware, the Gleaner did serialize an ethics handbook that we put out for policymakers who are wrestling with these almost impossible decisions, balancing the economy and public health.
I noticed on your website you have resources for policymakers, for journalists, for healthcare workers, with respect to how they should respond to COVID-19. What are some of the things that the task force would have discovered and would have said to policymakers, this is important in dealing with the pandemic?
Well, the ethics handbook, I think, has been, a little bit to my surprise, has been probably a fulcrum around a lot of what we have done. And it's available for free. It's very short. It's only around 30 pages. And it really just sets out certain principles. So the three principles, the abbreviation is RIR, R-I-R. So it's respect. So that's respect for human life and the dignity of the human, which goes all the way through. No one loses their dignity because they've been infected. Even a dead person does not lose their dignity, as they're being buried. And then, respect also comes with access to healthcare. Sometimes the dignity of the person is denied because they can't, or they think that they shouldn't be accessing healthcare, even if they don't have COVID. They might be afraid to go to hospital. And then I is the inclusiveness. You need to be inclusive, include everyone in society. And I think you always have to think of the people who are most vulnerable. Many of us can work from home, but it's very often people who are, for example, cleaning staff and things like that. They're the ones we should really be prioritizing, and not sort of forcing them onto public transport in a rush hour. Everything should be staggered so that they can be as safe as possible. Under responsibility, that really comes to personal responsibility. We all have a part to play in trying to keep the whole of society safe. So these kind of principles which we put down, I think they've really resonated with policymakers and the public. I mean, I recommend that everybody should just go on the website and just browse around. You'll see how your country is doing in relation to all the others in Caricom. We have these nice heat maps. We publish them every day.
And this is what I also liked about it, is that the policymakers could go, but also just the regular Caribbean individual can log on and get the information that they require and be able to respond.
Yeah, I mean, right now we're in a new phase. The new phase we're in, and this is the one I'm actually enjoying this, is what I call the fight back phase. We're actually fighting back now.
Yeah.
We have a vaccine. And so, you will see various short video clips where we speak about the vaccines, and whatever fears and concerns people might have, they can get answers there.
Mm-hmm. As a university, you also have access to research data and partnerships with other universities around the world, and governments may not have that. How do you see this giving your task force a distinct advantage as opposed to government response teams?
Yeah, no, I mean, this has been a very big year for publishing. We actually undertook a comparison of the Caribbean region. It was published in the Journal of International Development, and it showed that the Caribbean region was very successful from a public health standpoint in containing the pandemic, particularly last year. Mm-hmm. And that has translated into an actual reduction in cases and deaths. And the only way that you can really compare cases and deaths is if you do it per standard population size. So typically there you can express them, let's say, deaths per million, and then you can compare small countries with big countries and regions. And the Caribbean, even now with the difficulties we're seeing, particularly in Jamaica, even now we have about 1/10 of the deaths per million in the Caribbean compared to our neighbors to the north in North America and to the south in South America. So the Caribbean has done well.
What would you attribute that to, Professor? Would you think part of that is our early response, and also not just early, but the ways in which task force such as your own provide credible information and salient information?
Well, I think what's been very clear is that the Caribbean has responded to the science. Now, whether that science has come from us or whether it's come through CARFA and, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, we have also worked very closely with the Caribbean Disaster and Emergency Management Agency. They're really brilliant at handling logistics. And you know what? A pandemic is not that different from a hurricane event or something. It's a little bit more stretched out, but the same kind of issues apply. So, you would have disruptions to communication, to transport, to supply chains. You need to have strategic supply depots and things like that. And SEDEMA does that all very well. And then Caribbean people, I think they're also a little bit more adjusted to being given public health advice. So, if someone says to us, well, for your public health, there's a hurricane coming, there's a stay-at-home order, we accept that. And so basically, I think we've been a little bit more accepting of the stay-at-home orders than other countries have, who have really resisted and not been able to cope as well, maybe, as we have, because we're kind of used to these emergency events coming through our region.
Yeah.
So it was in conjunction with all of these agencies that really worked well that I think we have been able to contain it.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that. It's probably why I think as well we're, I guess, maybe better able to handle some of the mental challenges that come with COVID-19, because we faced a lot of disaster, and I think not that we haven't faced any mental health issues, but I think we've been pretty good at how we've been responding to some extent.
Good. I mean, you spoke about collaborations. We have one collaboration with UNESCO, and they actually came to us and they said, we've been quite impressed at the Caribbean at how they're handling this pandemic. And so we've written a couple of papers in what's known as the Inclusive Policy Lab, which is to try and give good policy examples, in this case for handling the pandemic through the UN. And, they have also been partnering with us. And the one area that, we are concerned about and which they will help us with. There's going to be a number of outreach events soon, actually has to do with the education gap. And that really worries me.
The challenges that our children have with access to data, the disparity in learning, is this something that the COVID-19 Task Force will also be looking at as well?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I don't want to sound like an advertisement, but on March the 30th, we're having a forum on Mind the Education Gap, the experience of the Caribbean, schooling in the Caribbean during a pandemic. And, you know, at UWI, I'm in charge in my day job of, you know, all teaching and learning and exams, because I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for undergraduate studies. And I was very, very concerned that we had to have equity of access when people are doing their exams online. There has to be equity. You can't have, let's say, middle-class students having access to all the materials and the teaching and the learning and the exams and doing well, and persons, you know, from poorer backgrounds not having good access, not having access to learning, or heaven forbid, not even being able to take the exam properly. And so, you know, we just went out of our way to have systems in place, and we had a lot of mock exams, and you know, where we could check that people had access, and lots of fail-safe mechanisms so that everybody could complete their teaching and learning. And we had very little disruption to our, you know, throughput and our graduations and all of that. So I think we've been able to handle that reasonably well, but by you know, the primary schools in particular and secondary schools, some of them have really struggled.
Yes, the term learning loss is something that we've become very familiar with at this time. We're moving into another phase of COVID-19. You mentioned it, vaccination, and it means there's more work for the task force ahead, trying to dispel a lot of misinformation and disinformation about vaccines and the ways in which we ought to respond as it unfolds. Where do we move from here, Professor?
I think we need to just give as accurate advice as possible. So, you know, I'm very happy to speak about the safety and efficacy of the vaccine that landed in Jamaica, or I'm happy to speak about, you know, some of the historical roots, which I think underpin some of the skepticism in Black and Caribbean populations. You know, there was a lot of unethical human experimentation that happened on Black populations in the last century. And, you know, they're real and they happened. And I think, you know, they underpin some of the skepticism that we see. But, you know, we have to try and address these issues, because I would hate for, you know, the history to repeat itself almost in an inadvertent way, that Black populations would not get access to the vaccines as well as other groups, which you know, is happening in Black populations in the US and UK, and not really accessing the vaccine as well as other groups. And you know, I will do everything possible to address people's concerns and you know, to try and ensure equity of access to these vaccines.
I think one of the challenges is because there's so many, and that they roll out in different phases, and so you'll hear that this one is 2 doses, this one is a single dose. Has the task force, I guess, reviewed all of them and given some advice in terms of what will work best for the Caribbean? Absolutely.
So, you know, I'm actually part of a task force that's meeting in Jamaica to provide such advice. So I do wish to speak about the dosing. So the vaccine that you're receiving is the AstraZeneca vaccine. And honestly, the data that's come out, both from the phase 3 clinical trial, but maybe more importantly from what I would call the real world experience, particularly in the UK, where the AstraZeneca vaccine has really been the backbone of their immunization program. And, you know, they have now immunized nearly 30 million people. You know, we've really got very good evidence that the first shot is providing excellent protection, particularly against severe disease and hospitalization and death. So, you know, the latest real world data coming out of the UK is that hospitalizations and deaths have gone down by 90% or even higher amongst the first group to receive the vaccine, which is the over 80s.
What's the fair Professor, the vaccine is here, and my concern, I don't know if it's yours as well, is that people may believe that it's here, and so we can now be maskless. We don't need to social distance. We don't need to take all the precautions that we do have to take until everyone is vaccinated.
Well, yes, until everyone is safe, I guess no one's safe, because you would always get pockets of outbreaks happening, depending on what proportion you can vaccinate. When you look at a country that's been going hell for leather to vaccinate now for 3 months, like the UK, they're still only around 40% vaccinated. It's going to take a while to get the population vaccinated. And until you reach something approaching herd immunity, which, you're going to achieve maybe around 70, 80%, we're not really sure, because some of the variants, the coverage might need to be slightly greater. Then, the epidemic will still be running through the society. But I do want to emphasize the positives. For persons who've received the first shot, and the gap between the first and the second shot is 3 months. For persons who've received the first shot, as soon as you've built some immunity after 3 weeks, the likelihood of you developing severe disease or ending up in hospital are very, 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 very minimal. I mean, this vaccine has been highly effective in preventing people developing severe disease and hospital. In a study of 35,000 people conducted in Brazil, South Africa, and the UK, which is, funnily enough, where all the variants are, there wasn't a single case of severe disease in a vaccinated person and hospitalization or death. It's really amazing.
Professor, before we go, what's the future for the task force?
We will be here until the World Health Organization declares this pandemic over. They declared it officially. They will eventually declare it over. We will continue working until that point.
All right. I want to thank you for all the work that you continue to do on the task force to make sure that the Caribbean is safe and that we respond effectively.
All right. Well, anyway, stay safe in Jamaica. It's been very nice speaking with you.
Thank you.
On our next episode,
from the onset, we had to institute some real stringent measures to have our people comply with the protocols that we were putting in place. As you know, us Caribbean people, we love our freedom. We love to be able to go to the beach and do all these things on a regular basis. So It was no easy task, getting our people to settle down, to understand that, this is serious and it has to do with all of us, and we will need everybody's cooperation in order for us to get out of it.
Yeah.
thank you so much for making it Caribbean Diaries. See you next week.